Hello, you're very welcome to another lockdown lecture from Waterloo Uncovered. My name is Peter Molloy, and I've had the privilege of being a volunteer with Waterloo Uncovered for the last couple of years. And I'm delighted to be able to talk to you a little bit today about the Irish story of Waterloo. Now, that's partially because, as an Irish person, this is a subject that's very close to my heart, and it's been a particular research interest of mine in the past. But I also think it's really important and really fitting to look at this Irish story a little bit and to put it in context in 1815, because it fits perfectly with our modern perspective and our modern understanding of the Waterloo campaign. And that is, of course, something which is genuinely multinational and multilateral. So what I'm going to try to do today is to give you a little bit of an overview of that Irish story, I suppose really by trying to answer two questions. The first one being the sort of who question. So, who are these Irish participants in 1815? What sort of roles are they fulfilling? What roads have brought them to the battlefields of the Waterloo campaign? And the second question, then, that I'm going to try to answer is the what question, looking at some of the practical experiences that they have on the battlefields of the campaign. There's a little bit of a spoiler alert at the very beginning, and that is that there are two things I'm not going to be talking about at any length today. And the first of those is what we might think of as being the sort of arrows on maps military history of the Waterloo campaign. So the various phases of the campaign and of the battles within it, the movements of the three armies and so on. I'm going to take all of that as read, other than where looking at specific episodes on the battlefield is directly relevant to this Irish experience of the campaign. The other thing that I'm not going to be talking much about today, or rather the other person, is this man. And no prizes for guessing who this is. Arthur Wellesley, first Duke of Wellington. And I think by far and away the most well-known Irish person involved in the Waterloo campaign. I love this photograph, by the way. Wellington is one of these great characters from history that we're far more used to seeing depicted in paintings or in sketches. So it's always a little bit arresting to see him in the flesh in an actual photograph. This is a daguerreotype from 1844. So we're seeing Wellington here at about the age of 75, nearly 30 years after Waterloo. But that profile, I think, and maybe that nose especially, they're still very recognisable from depictions of him earlier in life. I'm not going to be talking much about Wellington today, not because there isn't a lot to talk about when it comes to him, but more so because I don't think there's very much new that I can bring to the table in terms of his biography and in terms of his role as a commander during the Waterloo campaign. I think for our purposes today, it's probably sufficient just to note that he is indeed Irish. And this is the bit where I'm obliged to remind everybody that he never ever came out with that line in relation to Irishness, that being born in a stable doesn't make one a horse. It is a great line, but it was actually said about Wellington during the 1840s by Daniel O'Connell, the Irish MP and Catholic emancipation campaigner. Wellington is Irish, or he's Anglo-Irish, if it's important to you to make that distinction, as indeed are a large number of the Irish officers who fight under him at Waterloo. He's born here in Ireland in 1769, the same year as Napoleon, and Ireland features quite prominently in his early life and in his early career. In fact, the two career strands that are going to define Wellington, both as a soldier and as a politician, both of these begin while he's a young man here in Dublin, serving as a junior officer in Dublin Castle and also as an MP in the Irish Parliament. And by 1815 then, of course, if we sort of fast forward to the eve of Waterloo, he's long since become Britain's preeminent military commander. And so he's the natural choice to lead one of these two allied armies now assembling in Belgium to fight Napoleon. He's learned his trade during colonial campaigning in India in the late 1790s, the early 1800s. And then, of course, he's gone on to lead British and allied armies with great success against the French during the Peninsular War. But if we're not going to be looking much at Wellington himself, we certainly are going to be looking at the army that he leads in 1815 and at the Irish role within that army. Before we do that, I think it's important just to briefly contextualise Ireland's relationship with Britain and Ireland's position really as part of Britain during this period. And that is, in a word, fraught. So the 2 decades leading up to Waterloo have been a period of significant domestic unrest here in Ireland. We see throughout the 1790s growing demands for constitutional reform and also for civil and religious liberty. And this is directly influenced by revolution in France. It's directly influenced by what's happening on the continent. And we see the emergence then of the United Irishmen movement. And eventually, in 1798, we see the outbreak of full-scale rebellion in Ireland against Crown rule. And this is an incredibly brutal and violent episode. This is the Battle of Vinegar Hill in County Wexford, depicted here in this print. So a direct consequence of the 1798 rebellion is the Act of Union of 1800, which formally joins Ireland to Britain under the United Kingdom. And we see a further rebellion, Robert Emmet's rebellion, albeit on a much more abortive scale, in 1803. So pretty clearly, Ireland's position at this stage under British rule is quite an uneasy one in parts. And yet we have this paradox, because simultaneously, there's a very large Irish participation in the British Army. So we're going to look at that and at some of the potential reasons for it. So if we look at the Irish presence in the British Army in 1815, probably the most obvious manifestation is the existence of quite a number of Irish regiments. So what do we mean by Irish regiments? Well, these are units which have formal territorial affiliations to Ireland. They carry out recruiting here in Ireland, and in most cases we can expect them to have a large overall majority of Irish personnel in them, at least as far as the rank and file is concerned. So in other words, they're Irish both in style and in substance. And as you can see here, by the year of Waterloo, we have quite a few of these Irish regiments. Now, some of these more senior Irish regiments already have quite a long existence behind them by the Napoleonic period. A good example here might be the 18th Foot, the Royal Irish Regiment. Some of these older Irish regiments, like the 18th, go all the way back to the late 17th century and really to the establishment of the British Army itself as a standing force. And much more recently then, during the 1790s, we see a whole slew of new Irish regiments being raised. This is in response to the outbreak of war with France and to the expansion of the British Army. And in particular, you can see quite a number of new Irish infantry regiments here in the sort of 80 to 90 regimental series. And nearly all of these Irish regiments have seen global service over the last 2 decades of the wider revolutionary and Napoleonic period. So on the right here, we can see this print of the Irish 87th Foot capturing a French eagle at Barossa in Spain in 1811. This is the first time that an eagle is taken in action. And the man we see in the centre, actually in the act of seizing the eagle, is Sergeant Patrick Masterson from County Roscommon. And Masterson allegedly does this by crying out, "Bejesus, boys, I have the cuckoo." Allegedly, anyway. I suspect there may be an element of stage Irishness at play there. So what's interesting then is that when we hone in on Wellington's army at Waterloo specifically, or rather at the British portion of that army, it's always a point that bears repetition that Wellington obviously doesn't command a British army at Waterloo. He commands a multinational allied army. Probably only about a third of that force comes from anywhere in the British Isles. But when we look at that third or so, when we look at the British portion of Wellington's army, yeah, we do have Irish regiments there, but there aren't a great many of them. We can see 3 here, 1 infantry battalion and 2 cavalry regiments. And you might notice, by the way, this title Enniskillen on 2 of these regiments. This is a corruption of the spelling of the town of Enniskillen in County Fermanagh in the northwest of Ireland. And Enniskillen is sometimes claimed, anyway, as being the only town in the British Isles to have given its name in this way to 2 separate regiments in the British Army, both this infantry regiment and the cavalry regiment. So we do have these 3 Irish regiments present, and all of them do take a full role in the campaign. None are involved at Quatre Bras on the 16th of June, but all 3 are on the field itself at Waterloo 2 days later. and we will be coming across them again in places later on. And quite understandably, I think, these three regiments have always been a focus in terms of examining the Irish experience at Waterloo. And why wouldn't they be? They're Irish regiments containing Irish soldiers, so they kind of do what they say on the tin. But I suppose the question here is it the case that if we're looking to find Irish soldiers on the battlefields of this campaign, we're only going to find them within these units? And the answer to that is very, very definitely no. There's actually a much broader pattern of Irish service in the British Army during this period, and Waterloo is no exception to this. So what we generally see suggested is figures kind of in between 30% and 40%. So in other words, that at any given stage during this period, between about 30 and 40% of the British Army is actually Irish. And it's possible to test this out a little bit. So as part of my research into the Irish at Waterloo, I've looked in a little bit more detail in the past at two units within Wellington's army in 1815. And what I'm mainly drawing on here are what are called the description books for each battalion covering this period. These are held in the National Archives at Kew, just outside London. And these give you quite a bit of biographical information for individual soldiers in each regiment, which could be cross-referenced against Waterloo service. And what this includes, crucially, is their place of origin across the British Isles. And it shows these two units more or less at random. The only thing they've got in common is that neither are in any way Irish regiments in 1815. So the First Foot are the Royal Scots, the senior line infantry regiment in the British Army, and in theory, as you'd guess, they're a lowland Scottish regiment. And much in the same vein, the 32nd Foot is an English county regiment associated with Cornwall in 1815, again, in theory. But what we actually start to see when we look under the bonnet here is that we have quite a significant Irish presence in both during the campaign. So it's well over a third in the case of the First Foot, and it's over a quarter Irish in the case of the 32nd Foot. And for a couple of reasons, these are probably minimal figures rather than definitive totals. For one thing, we're looking, with these particular records, we're looking at privates and NCOs only. So we're not seeing the potential additional presence of Irish officers. So what does that tell us? If we take these proportions as being representative of a lot of the British units in Wellington's army in 1815, if not a majority, and I think there's a lot of good reason to suppose that we can do that with some confidence, clearly we're starting to get an impression here of an Irish presence that's really very substantial in numerical terms. We're really now looking at thousands of Irish soldiers rather than just a few hundred concentrated together in these three formerly Irish regiments that we've already come across. And it's admittedly a little bit of a back of the envelope type calculation. But if we extrapolate these figures out across the whole British portion of Wellington's army, which is, give or take, it's about 25,000 strong, what we might be looking at is an overall Irish representation during the campaign of maybe anything from 7,000 soldiers upwards, maybe as high as 10,000, something in the region of 10,000 soldiers. I would suggest that figures in that range are defensible and are plausible. So pretty clearly, this is a large-scale national bloc within Wellington's army. We're starting to get an impression here of an Irish presence that isn't just incidental, and it certainly isn't just concentrated within the couple of individual Irish units that we see involved in the campaign. And there's another really valuable aspect to looking at some of these Irish soldiers in this kind of granular level of detail. And that's the impression we can start to get of who these men are, aside from just the fact that they happen to be Irish, but more so, what their backgrounds are, what sort of roads may have led them to Waterloo. So this description book material also includes a lot of other relevant biographical detail for individual soldiers. So we've got a sample group here from across these two battalions of just over 400 Irish soldiers present during the Waterloo campaign. And from this, we can make a couple of interesting observations. So first of all, this is a group that is representative of the entire island of Ireland, in the sense that we've got soldiers here from all 32 counties. There are a couple of patterns there you can maybe begin to make out. There are some Irish counties that are maybe featuring more often than others, and regions. But in the most general sense, this is genuinely a kind of an all island group. In age terms, this is a fairly mature bunch. There's an average age here amongst these privates and NCOs of 26. And it's also a relatively experienced group. Just short of 75% of these men have been in the British Army for at least 2 years or more by 1815. What's most interesting, though, is that we've got prior civilian occupations listed for almost all of these Irishmen. So what they were doing before enlisting into the British Army. And this is really revealing. So what we're seeing here is that just a hair under half of these men are listed as labourers, and nearly another third then are former weavers. The balance is a mixture of various other backgrounds. So what does this tell us? Well, I think what it's strongly hinting at is an economic motivation for enlistment in a lot of these Irish cases. Now, this word, labourer, it's a bit of a catch-all term, and it can potentially cover a lot of different civilian backgrounds during this period. But generally speaking, it carries an implication of an Irish recruit who's coming from some level of economic uncertainty. This is somebody who doesn't have a steady trade that they can rely on in income terms. And likewise, it's significant again that in that next highest category, we're seeing a lot of former Irish weavers. Hand weaving is a trade that's been put under increasing pressure across the British Isles during this period. So I think, again, we're getting a clear suggestion here of the economic element being an important one in the decisions of many ordinary Irish soldiers to enlist during this period. And I've just included two excerpts from this description book material on the right there, just to serve as an example. And apologies, they're a little bit difficult to make out on screen, but they're not actually much easier in person. The handwriting on these Napoleonic records is always a little bit challenging. But I do think it's very important, wherever we can, to humanise these Irishmen a little, to lift them from being just sort of rank and file background extras in this Waterloo story. So at the top here, we've got Private James Dillon from Rathangan in County Kildare. And he's a labourer when he enlists into the First Foot in 1807 at the age of 24. Interestingly, in most of these cases, we also have, as well as these written biographical details, we also have a brief description of each individual recruit. That's not there, I think it's fair to say, for reasons of sentimentality or posterity, but rather as an aid to identification, because desertion is a problem, or it's a potential problem here. So in Dillon's case, we see that he has a fresh complexion, grey eyes, brown hair, and a long face. And down below him then we have Corporal Patrick Murphy, who sees service during the campaign in the 32nd Foot. He's from Temple Michael in County Longford. And again, we've another former labourer here. He enlists in May 1810 at the age of 20. So far, we've been looking at this Irish presence in Wellington's army from the ground up. So we've been concentrating on ordinary soldiers and NCOs. But there's also a very substantial Irish officer cohort here. Now, admittedly, most of these Irishmen are coming from very different social and economic backgrounds on the island to a lot of these rank and file soldiers that we've just met. But they are Irish nonetheless, and they're an important part of this story. So at the most senior level, and you can see these men here, We have not one, not two, but three Irish generals commanding brigade level formations under Wellington. We actually almost see an Irish divisional commander at Waterloo. Galbraith Larry Cole, General Sir Galbraith Larry Cole, County Fermanagh. He's down to lead the 6th Division under Wellington during the campaign. But he's actually back in Britain getting married when Napoleon invades, so he misses the whole thing. But we do have this trio of Irish generals here, and all of them are very experienced commanders by 1815. They've all served in the Peninsula and elsewhere. So going through them left to right pretty quickly, on the left here we see Major General Sir John Ormsby Vandeleur from a County Clare family. He commands the 4th British Cavalry Brigade during the campaign. Vandeleur actually ends up taking command of the entire Allied cavalry arm towards the close of the Battle of Waterloo, when the Earl of Uxbridge is wounded. In the middle then, we have Major General Sir Denis Pack from County Kilkenny, and Pack commands the 9th British Infantry Brigade under Sir Thomas Picton. And this is actually probably one of the most fully committed formations in Wellington's army during the campaign. Pack's brigade sees very heavy fighting, both at Quatre Bras and at Waterloo itself on the 18th of June. And finally then on the left, we have poor old Major General Sir William Ponsonby, who's from a very well-established Anglo-Irish dynasty in County Cork. And I think it's safe to say he's probably the best known of these three Irish generals, but for fairly unhappy reasons. Ponsonby leads the 2nd British Cavalry Brigade, which is widely known as the Union Brigade, because it's 3 heavy cavalry regiments, are English, Scottish and Irish respectively. And I think most of you will probably be familiar with what happens to the Union Brigade at Waterloo itself. The British Heavy Cavalry launched what's initially a fairly perfectly timed, perfectly executed counterattack against the French infantry of d'Erlon's corps. And this is during the first real opening move of the battle. But what happens is that the British cavalry end up charging on too far, and they get very disordered and cut up themselves by counterattacking French cavalry. And Ponsonby is killed during this engagement. There are a couple of different versions of how exactly he loses his life, but the general theme is that his horse gets bogged down in mud and he's caught by French lancers. And this is how it's portrayed in the 1970 film, which I'm sure a lot of you will have seen. And this makes him the most senior Irish fatality at Waterloo. His body is recovered and he's buried in London. And there is also a memorial to him today in St Paul's Cathedral in London. We also have a very widespread of Irish officers at lower levels of command in Wellington's army. In fact, at every commissioned level of command down from here. So we have a number of Irishmen serving as commanding officers of battalions or regiments. We have a lot of more junior Irish officers, majors, captains, lieutenants, ensigns, and so on. And we also have Irish officers serving in extra regimental positions, like on the staff. So I've just chosen 2 of these more junior Irish officers to briefly look at to represent this group. And they're both fairly interesting characters in their own right. So on the left, although obviously photographed much later on in life, this is Major George de Lacy Evans from County Limerick. And this is another photograph of an Irish Waterloo veteran that I have to say I really enjoy, primarily because of this fairly irascible look on de Lacy Evans's face. And I've seen at least 1 or 2 other photographs of him from around this same period, and I can confirm that this does seem to be a bit of a theme. He tends to look this cross in front of the camera most of the time. But he's quite an experienced soldier by 1815. He served in the Peninsula. He's also been in North America. And at Waterloo, he's serving as an ADC to Sir William Ponsonby, who we just met on the staff of the Union Brigade. And there's a wonderful eyewitness account from de Lacy Evans about this charge of the heavy cavalry at Waterloo. He talks about d'Erlon's infantry fleeing backwards across the valley like a flock of sheep. And he's probably very lucky to have escaped Ponsonby's fate during this part of the battle. De Lacy Evans's own horse takes a sabre cut across its head. But he does survive the battle, and he does go on to enjoy a very interesting career after Waterloo. So he leads the British Legion during the 1830s, which is this sort of quasi-official intervention force that goes across to Spain during the Carlist War. And incidentally, this is an episode that quite a number of Irish Napoleonic veterans are caught up in, but it's a bit outside our scope today. And he ends his military career then serving as a British divisional commander in the Crimea in the 1850s. And on the right then, we have Major George O'Malley, who's a Mayo man. And he takes over the command of the 44th Foot when its commanding officer is badly wounded at Quatre Bras. And that original CO, who's wounded on the 16th of June, is actually another Irishman, as it happens, John Millet Hamerton from County Tipperary. Interestingly, O'Malley's very first experience of combat against the French actually takes place here in Ireland. He's serving with the yeomanry at Castlebar in August 1798 during the French invasion. This is the landing of General Humbert's French expeditionary force in Mayo. Finally then, in terms of the overall who question of the Irish at Waterloo, and we're going to look at the what of that Irish experience in a moment, it's really important, I think, that we don't overlook what's pretty much undoubtedly the presence of Irish civilians during the campaign. So in other words, not all of the Irish eyewitnesses to these events are necessarily wearing a uniform, carrying a weapon. So the presence of civilian dependents, both women and children, following armies along on campaign, this is a feature of all Napoleonic campaigns. And the Duke of Wellington's army at Waterloo is no exception. It's difficult to quantify, but we know there's an Irish contingent here. And really, I think it's fair to say that these civilians are, for the most part, sharing the exact same hardships on campaign as the soldiers they accompany. It might be true that they don't actually have to face battle itself when it comes to that, but they arguably have just as great a psychological burden at that point. They have to wait anxiously nearby for news of their loved ones, within earshot of the guns, listening to it all unfold. We have this account from Edward Costello from County Laois, who's a corporal with the 95th Rifles, and probably one of the best known Irish memoirists of the British Army during this period. But he talks about returning wounded to the rear at Quatre Bras and having to sort of run the gauntlet of camp followers of this sort just behind the front line, all of them anxiously pressing him and the other walking wounded for news of their loved ones. There is a very persistent Irish Waterloo story linked to this, which is that of Mrs. Elizabeth McMullen. And she's described as being the wife of an Irish private in the 27th Foot, the Inniskillings. When her husband is badly wounded at Waterloo, Mrs. McMullen allegedly helps him to the rear, despite being pregnant at the time. To be perfectly honest, I'd actually always taken that one with a large pinch of salt. But a couple of years ago, I did come across a fairly intriguing reference in an account by Charlotte Eaton. She's a Scottish woman present in Belgium in 1815, and she leaves this wonderful account of the period immediately around the campaign and especially its aftermath. And interestingly, she mentions encountering a couple who very closely match this description, actually, in terms of the experience that they've just had on the battlefield. And she doesn't give a surname for them, but she does specifically give the soldiers' regiment as the 27th Foot. So maybe there might be something to this story. On the left here, we have a quote from Captain Cavalier Mercer of the Royal Horse Artillery. And this is his impression of encountering Irish camp followers of this kind as he comes ashore at Ostend in April 1815 during the build-up to the campaign. So that's really the who of this Irish story.